We want to talk about Newsom's special session. The governor put on this special session to essentially Trump-proof California. Part of what's in this is a $25 million legal defense fund to, litigate any matters that may be inconsistent between California and federal law or federal policy that we may see coming from the Trump administration. Tim, I guess the place to start with you is for a state that had at times when it's politically opportune, when the opportunity is there to talk about not spending and not increasing a budget, and not increasing a deficit anymore, it seems like all of a sudden now that gets thrown out the window with a new presidential administration. What do you make of this $25 million fund that we can potentially see California access to combat any legal issues with the federal government?
Well, yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I was at the Capitol on Monday for the swearing in for the new, legislature, and right away, Republicans in the state Senate and state Assembly took Governor Newsom to task on this, spending more money when California doesn't have it, and particularly when so many people and there's so many other problems and issues and things kind of top of mind that I think California voters this past election said that they wanted California to deal with. The first thing that the governor puts, top of the agenda is fighting the Trump administration, which, again, like President Trump or not, he did do much better in 2024 in California in a lot of counties than he did in 2020, and received a heck of a lot of votes. So I don't know that it was particularly the most prudent thing for Governor Newsom to do, but Governor Newsom certainly has one eye on policy, but the other eye, or maybe even both eyes at times, on the political and raising his profile for a national audience.
And Brittany, it seems like the two big issues that I think when we look at the difference between California and the federal government that we would think under Trump would be, abortion policy, which was already, taken back for Roe v. Wade, and other things related to women's health, things that we can maybe think about like contraceptives, maybe a ban there or something of the sort. And the only other thing I can think of too, off the top of my head, would be something like environmental policy as well, and immigration. So, okay, so maybe three things, but it's outside of those few things, it doesn't seem like there's much that separates what could happen in the federal government than what we see in the state. And even on issues like immigration, ICE has clearly said, if you're not going to come in, we're going to come in instead. But it doesn't seem like there's much issue why you would have to have a legal defense fund for it.
Right. And you just named three or four really big issues, and there's only $25 million going into this fund. I think that what Newsom is doing is political posturing and virtue signaling. He wants to run for president in 2028. Has 2 years left in office, and he wants to make a name for himself even more so on a national level. And when we think about, other folks falling in line, California seems to be sort of one of the first to do these sorts of things. He wants to be able to say, listen, I took Trump on head on, and all of these people decided to follow my lead. That's what he wants. And so I think at the end of the day, I agree with Tim. There are a million things that he could have focused on. I mean, he went from having $100 billion surplus to now being about $50 billion in debt in California, that deficit. And that is absolutely insane. So there's plenty to do, like focus on our homelessness issue, terrible traffic, gas prices, housing. But he wants to do this political game. And I think that the American people show that they're sick of that.
Well, I mean, even something, Tal, I think where you would go and you'd say, well, if you're going to put in $25 million of this fresh money, you would put it maybe towards housing for these immigrants that you'd want to protect from ICE, or something else that would maybe go to aid those issues, as opposed to just putting in this defense fund, as opposed to, actually addressing, the issues with this monetary amount.
Yeah, I think it's important to note too that considering the size of California, $25 million isn't really a material amount of money like it is to a normal person in our state, but to our state government, it's a drop in the bucket. I also don't think that we were one $25 million expenditure from the Newsom administration choosing to litigate everything that comes out of Washington under the Trump administration. So I think this was theater. What I'm less sort of certain about is kind of who the constituency is that they're conveying this message to, that they're posturing to. It appears that the President Trump had increased some of his performance with African Americans, with Hispanics, certainly with Asian Americans. I don't know which sort of choir Governor Newsom is singing to. That being said, I think Tim and Brittany would recognize that I don't think these things are done in a vacuum. There's, someone sits in a room and thinks through the next decision, the next press conference, the next special session. In this case, there are very intelligent people that are making these decisions. I just think they might be basing it on a premise that I don't understand. The only thing I can think of is they expect that there will be a lot of pushback to some of what's coming out of this Republican Congress and the Trump administration, and that there will then be a sort of place for someone to sort of rise up and be the counter to that. But that really remains to be seen. So either they're really clever and they're outthinking everybody, or they're just completely off base. But I don't really know how it would be in between.
Well, I think the cynical view of it, Tim, would be to say, well, it's not, it's the posturing, and it's for not necessarily people in California, but it's for disillusioned, maybe liberals and progressives across the country. I know that one of the things that Newsom was trying to do in the last couple of years was try to put himself as this progressive and this liberal alternative to Governor DeSantis in Florida, and maybe try to make California a type of safe haven and is a place for where people could possibly go to if they feel unsafe in these other states. That maybe seems what this kind of thing is. And if not, of course, a presidential run too, right, Tim?
Well, certainly, and I don't know that people are clamoring to move to California. Businesses certainly aren't. And I think that people are doing their walking, or they're voting not only with their ballots but also with their payments to U-Haul and to real estate in other states, and we've seen that pretty dramatically over the last couple of years. But I do think looking forward, something also to consider is we do have a governor's race coming up in 2026, where you're going to have a number of candidates on the Democratic side, and probably have some on the Republican side too. And will we actually have a campaign and people running for that office that are going to focus and talk about solving these California problems? Because in every public opinion poll that I've seen in California, during this election cycle, Gavin Newsom's approval ratings were below Joe Biden's, and dramatically below Joe Biden's. And so for me, it's going to be taking a look at here, really as we get into January, February, March, and as some of these, we're talking about governor campaigns for California, kicking off and starting kind of their forward momentum. If these Democrats are going to seek to put some distance between them and Gavin Newsom, and also particularly members of the state assembly and state senate, Democratic members who might be in some swing seats, some volatile seats, where they're looking to kind of protect kind of their moderate to center right constituency, and and seek to separate themselves a little bit from what Governor Newsom is trying to do in this fight that he's trying to wage, with Washington, D.C. So I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Brittany, I know you worked for some time, with Nikki Haley, or in support of Nikki Haley, and with Principles First for Republicans. Can you talk to us about? It seems like the idea is that, okay, we're just assuming that everyone who didn't vote for Trump is going to jump in line with this policy or with anything that Newsom does that's anti-Trump. But that's not the case for most people. Most people just want some sense of normalcy. Has been always the argument that I've heard coming from your group at Principles First. Is that kind of the case here too? It's like, this isn't normal either, even if you're going polar opposite of what's coming in with the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this election, and listen, people, I'm sure there will be plenty of people who disagree with me. The way that I see sort of the results of this election wasn't necessarily a very pro-Trump victory, but it was a Biden and Democrat defeat. And I think right now what we see is sort of a referendum on Biden specifically, and those Democrat policies that he peddled during his time in office. And I think also it has to do with the wokeness and people sort of being tired of that be overly politically correct culture. I think it's important. I think words matter, of course, but even we see comedians saying over and over again on those Netflix series or their specials, like, the political correctness is too much, right? And I think that we see some of that coming absolutely. But when we talk about sort of what we already see coming out of the Trump administration, he's not getting sworn in for still another month and a half. I think that we do see some of those Republican senators, especially saying like, okay, this is too far. We saw that with Matt Gaetz. I know Will and we already talked about this, but we saw that with Matt Gaetz. Now we're seeing that with Hegseth. I don't know what's going to happen with him. I would not be surprised if he did end up pulling out, but time will tell. We also see that kind of with people pushing back on RFK. And again, soon he won that Senate Majority Leader seat, excuse me, that Senate Majority Leader spot, as opposed to Rick Scott, who the MAGA activists online were propelling or pushing forward, when in reality, Rick Scott didn't do the best job when he was at the NRSC as chair over there. So when I think about all of those things, I think we do see people pushing back in their own way. Now, they might not be saying it publicly. They might kind of be doing it underhanded or like with their private votes and that sort of thing. But I think that there is a way to go about it. And if people are paying attention, I think that they'll notice that keep happening, especially when we're talking about these nominations coming out.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see, just what exactly the dialogue is especially we get these recess appointments as it goes for those cabinet picks. And Tal, back to you on California issues. I want to ask you about, people went to the polls voting mostly for the economy, voting for immigration as well, and some of these more normal issues. What do you make of the new state assembly class, new state senate class? Are they really in line with what we've seen, as far as this special session being called? Are they people that are maybe, hey, let's get right to work, and this isn't what we're supposed to be here to be doing? What do you make of this new class that's coming in?
Yeah, from a legislative leadership standpoint, at least on the majority side, I think it will become a story of waning influence on the part of the governor, right? So most of these guys have several terms left, right? So as the governor's finishing his time and people are looking sort of over his shoulder to who's going to be the next governor, I think you'll see legislative leaders, Democrats in this particular case, begin to carve out their own agendas and look to solidify their own political futures and not be as tied to the governor's sort of wishes or agenda. And then on the Republican side, I do think that there is some Republicans feel a little bit more emboldened than certainly as compared to like the congressional delegation that appears to have lost 2 or 3 seats. Legislative Republicans in Sacramento, I think, feel a sense of excitement. There are a couple of newer, younger members, some with roots right here in the San Joaquin Valley, that I think believe that there is a future for the Republican Party in California. I think if you asked that question 2, 4, 6 years ago, you'd probably find fewer people that were excited about it. We'll find out pretty quickly if what happened a couple of weeks ago was sort of a watermark for as good, is this as good as things can get for Republicans, or the beginning of a trend. And I think the actions of both Democrats and Republicans in the coming months will determine that. I think there's an opportunity for Republicans to maybe approach things a little bit differently than they have in the past, maybe to be this sort of party of hope and of progress. So not necessarily progressive policies, but at least moving things forward and making the government work for regular folks. Or you could see just sort of us reverting back to the way things have been leading up to this point. And that'll be decided in the coming weeks. I would expect that in the coming months, Governor Newsom begins to, maybe the calls back from legislative leaders take a little bit longer than they have in the past. Because, like any elected official, as your time begins to conclude, people start to worry a little bit less about what you can do for them or do to them if they don't happen to agree with you.
And Tim, I think on that point as well, when we look at Newsom and we look at, I guess, as we were just talking about, kind of that waning influence, and it seems like the move is more, and we talked about this in the last question too, but more for marketing and marketing for what his campaign could look like going forward versus what we're going to see necessarily on the ground. And it doesn't look like, as what Tal was just saying too, if your move is to sort of stymie a new Republican movement, this doesn't seem to be the place to start with to make the move to call a special session. That seems to continue to prolong the momentum and say, you know what, we've had this point. His interests aren't for what we're trying to get done in solving these issues that we talked about, whether it's the economy or immigration or whatnot, especially energy policy here in the Central Valley. It's going to be to go after, the president of the United States, who likely has no interest in attacking us anyway.
Yeah, I mean, let's be real. I mean, Gavin Newsom has always been about Gavin Newsom. first and foremost. I mean, even the Democrats in California realize that. And they've had to, as Tal said, for the last 6 years, they've had to deal with him. But now, they're looking at a future where they don't have to deal with Gavin Newsom, or they have to deal with someone else. And I think that's critically important. But from Newsom's perspective, I mean, he's talked about building hundreds of thousands of new, housing units in California. That never happened, didn't even come close to materializing. He's talked about fixing the homeless crisis. Operation Room Key and some of those things were just complete failures. Everything that he's touched over the last, 6 years, it's hard to point to anything that's been a success or that we're going to be able to look at in 10 years and say, you know what, that is a hallmark. That is one good thing that came out of the Newsom administration. I can't think of one. And so I think, everything that he's done really has not necessarily been for California, or has not been for even the Democratic Party. Certainly hasn't been for the Republican Party, but it's been to further in some way Gavin Newsom's political career. I mean, that's been his MO since he was elected, mayor of San Francisco. Everything has been about the next thing, a next big thing for him. And so right now, what we're seeing is just kind of a continuation of that, of how he's operated and that kind of political mindset that he's had. And so, as we look at any of these things that Governor Newsom says, again, we point to the past and we can say, well, he hasn't delivered on anything he's really talked about doing for California. And, the things that he's talking about right now, whether it's this, defense fund or anything else that he's mentioned, it's really about something else. It's about the next big thing for him. And in my mind, and I think, there's a lot of people out there that think that, yeah, then that next big thing is him running for president in 4 years and figuring out a way, after the next 2 years is over and he's not governor anymore, to continue to stay relevant in national politics.
And this last round of questions here, I think, Brittany, to start with you, what do you think this next kind of cycle, or this next wave of Republican politics in California looks like? Does it look like a continued push for some of these House seats and these House districts through the Central Valley? Or are we going to see continued, gains in some of these city areas where we're going to see maybe, some of these voting swings where you see maybe normally a 75-25 in favor of Republican, or in favor of Democrats, maybe start to shift to more 65-35 or something, where it's maybe not as noticeable, but you start to see that Republican shift a little bit more in the cities as opposed to the Central Valley. Basically, have they maxed out the Central Valley, and are the gains to be made in the cities?
I think when we think of the state of California, we think of it as obviously being very blue, and I'm not suggesting otherwise. But when you look at the actual breakdown of numbers of the amount of registered Republicans in California, or even the amount of votes that Trump got in California, I mean, that's bigger than it's literally bigger than half of the states in the country. That is how many people are in California. That is how many Republicans are in California. So yes, it is very blue, but there's absolutely an opportunity, I think, for us to take advantage of that. It starts at the local level. And unfortunately, we've seen that we lost some Republican seats that we thought that we would win. We just got the Duarte officially the results, and that was a sad thing, because I have friends who are in that office, right? And from a personal level, but also, he was doing good things for the community too. And so I do think that I think if you're a Republican watching this thinking like, oh, I'll never have a shot, you need to go for it. Why not? I mean, the worst thing that can happen is you lose, right? And I think that in order for us to keep progressing and moving forward, we have to put good Republicans in those seats and have viable candidates in those seats. And I think what would be super helpful, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but is if we got rid of the top two primary system in California. I think that obviously benefits Democrats more than Republicans here, and they're in a super majority. So I don't think that's going to disappear. However, if it did, and if it was more of a traditional Republican Democrat, I think you would see a lot of Republicans who just offer common sense solutions being able to win some of these seats. But oftentimes it's just two Democrats running against each other. And where's the fun in that? Come on, like, let us have some competition here. Give us a chance.
And what ends up happening with that too is a lot of times you get the Republican I know the big complaint this year was you get, Steve Garvey, or you get that celebrity Republican, or the Republican that's in touch with a lot more of maybe hardline views, because that's what people openly want more in a Trump administration, and a Trump-led Republican Party, and a California Republican Party that's in line with the Trump goals versus if you had a more competitive format. I guess the point being, Tal, I guess if we ever see this, it's because Democrats eventually, the Democratic Party of California didn't get the candidates that they want out of those primaries, right? That's the only way that that changes.
Yeah, I think there is a movement on the part of voters to follow individual candidates more than sort of having to respect the infrastructure of political parties too. There's really talented people on both sides of the aisle in California. There's great consultants and folks helping out in campaigns. But I do think that especially in a post-Trump era, which I think will come in hopefully around 4 years, right? I mean, good or bad, whatever happens, I don't think he'll be running again. What's going to be left of the Republican Party? And then if there's not, sort of Republican Party, then what's the value of a Democratic Party? I think we could begin to move towards individual candidates. And there's an ability now for individual candidates to develop their own following, to have that fundraising base, the infrastructure they used to rely on and sort of like party bosses, for lack of a better term. That's changed in large part because of President Trump. He was able to circumvent that entire process. Early on, there was no support from the kind of traditional Republican establishment, right? So anyway, I do think that we're entering a new era of politics where political parties might matter less. And I think that's a good thing for democracy. And I think it's a good thing for America, because I don't know that we've necessarily produced better candidates or leaders as a result of the party infrastructure. I think it's just, we knew what to expect, but those molds are being broken up and down the state of California and across the country.
And Tim, is there any incentive from Newsom's office in these last 2 years to change the courses of their actions? Because it seems like without any significant pushback, now they have this election behind them essentially, so this is his last Congress to work with. There's no need to change the way that he's operating, especially if he thinks it helps him in the national spotlight, as opposed to necessarily what we've talked about and the issues that we've seen around California.
Yeah, why would he? I mean, he's managed to, get, things he has managed to do over the last 6 years. He's built one of the biggest and most robust national fundraising operations of any Democratic candidate in the country. Just with some of the things that he's done in terms of attacking Trump and working on some of these very progressive issues and taking the tour of red states that he did last year and some of the other things. He has absolutely built a political machine nationally from a fundraising perspective, and even from a political perspective, and has his face and is known. I mean, how many governors do you know around the country? I mean, we know a few. There's some household names, certainly Ron DeSantis, and Tim Walz just ran for, was just on the ticket for vice president. But certainly Gavin Newsom is one of those kind of national Democratic names that people know, and they know who he is, and it evokes either a positive response from progressives and liberals, or a real negative response from, oh, hey, you've got that Gavin Newsom guy out in California. I mean, how many times have we heard that from relatives that live in other states? It's like, oh yeah, how you guys doing over there? So either way, they know his name and they know his face, and so he has been very successful at that. And so if from a political standpoint, in his political operation, I wouldn't change course at all. In fact, I kind of double down, which is what I think he's going to do if the ultimate goal is running for president.
All right, well, we will leave it there. And I'm glad, we were talking about the relatives and how much they talk about Governor Newsom. And I know we were talking about a lot about Newsom today, but I'm glad that Brittany did manage to throw in a Matt Gaetz reference too, just for the second most talked about person.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to. Just that's how my mind works. So at the end, I was like, "What was the initial question?" I just totally pivoted. I'm sorry.
No worries. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate all your times today. We enjoyed it as always, and looking forward to seeing what's next and what this recess period looks like between now and the President-elect Trump's inauguration date. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.